Early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah hadn't planned to be in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns. But something about the recent surge in complaints about discriminatory traffic citations had drawn her from her comfortable office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Security guards nodded at familiar faces, clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants whispered to their lawyers. Sarah observed it all with keen eyes, her notepad ready on her lap. Her pen moved swiftly, documenting the subtle interactions. How some people were greeted with smiles while others she received curt nods. How certain defendants were interrupted while others were allowed to speak at length. She wasn't just any observer. Though few in the room knew it as one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including judges who now presided in these very courts. Her articles about judicial bias were required reading in law schools from coast to coast, and her expert testimony had influenced several landmark cases about racial discrimination. Today, however, she sat discreetly in the back row, dressed conservatively in her blazer and pencil skirt, indistinguishable from any other professional who might have gotten a ticket for running a red light or some such thing. Her own citation for an alleged parking violation on K Street was tucked in her briefcase. She had thought briefly about just paying the fine online, but something about the situation, the inadequately posted signage, the officer's obnoxious attitude had made her decide to fight it. The room filled gradually with more people. Young and old, well-dressed and sloppy. It seemed from all the spectrums of the diverse population of Washington were more striking. Sarah noticed instinctively how people separated into invisible, striking lines of demarcation. The sensitive trained eye picked out anxiety in the subways. It came across differently on the faces, defiance, resignation. And on a few, the confident ease with which the system knew well at exactly 9 a.m. the BFF's voice boomed. Instructing all to rise, Sarah stood with the rest, straight-backed yet easy in her stance. She saw Judge Michael Harrison enter into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him. His reputation preceded him as a peculiarly strict judge when it came to traffic violations, particularly if those involved were minority defendants. What this young judge could not see was that among those that he would be called upon to pass judgment on today sat nothing other than the very professor who had taught him constitutional law and had written one of his recommendations for with the appointment of Judge I.L. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she observed his confident stride to the bench. She remembered him as an eager student, always the first one to raise his hand, passionate about justice, but at times blind to his own preconceptions. As the proceedings began and cases were called one after another, Sarah continued her keen observations, documenting each interaction, each decision, each subtle shift in tone. She knew well that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice came not from within the textbooks or lectures, but from real life. Experiences that were to make them confront their biases. Little did anyone in that courtroom know this ordinary Monday morning was about to become an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the stubborn challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket with practiced efficiency. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast the shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. As he sipped his black coffee, his clerk could arrange the day's cases in neat stacks. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions that most of his colleagues considered mundane. But Harrison sought each case as an opportunity to uphold the law, no matter how small the violation. His reputation for being particularly strict preceded him through the courthouse hallways. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his no-nonsense approach, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. There were whispers that, as the youngest, he had something to prove, and others who believed he was simply building a record for judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical. 27 cases, all but a few traffic violations. Harrison scanned them, making mental notes. His eyes paused briefly on a parking citation on K Street, noting the defense named Sarah Bennett. Something about the name tickled at his memory, but he dismissed it. After handling a few thousand cases, names often seem vaguely familiar. As he donned his black robes, Harrison recalled his law school days at Georgetown. Those halls had shaped and molded his understanding of justice. In law, he remembered passionate discussions about constitutional rights, about fairness and equality. Yet here in traffic court, he had found his own interpretation of justice, swift, strict, and unwavering. The bailiff knocked on his door, signaling it was time. Harrison gathered his papers, straightened his spine, and took a deep breath in the mirror. He checked his reflection, young face composed in grave lines, hair calmly harnessed to a decent, robes impeccably preened, the very picture of judicial gravitas that he struggled to perfect. Pacing down the private hallway to his courtroom, Harrison recited his personal mantras: stay in control, play no favorites, and never deviate from the letter of the law. It was those tenets that had carried him through his inaugural year on the bench with aplomb, if not certainly with goodwill. For a fleeting second, his mind flashed to his constitutional law professor at Old State U, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear. Now, in the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler. Black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the courtroom door. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In moments, he would assume his position of authority, ready to dispense justice as he saw fit, unaware that this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. All rise. The bay's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his expression stern and confident, completely unaware that among faces turned to him was one that would remind him of lessons he had summoned, now forgotten, along his path to the bench. The morning continued with Judge Harrison's usual speed and efficiency until case number 47 was called. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street, the clerk droned, her voice carrying across the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose effortlessly from her seat, deliberate movements full of dignity as she approached the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used all morning. Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it? Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, not guilty, Your Honor. She began to explain about the obstructed signage and confusing rules of parking. But Harrison cut her off mid-sentence, something had been doing frequently with defendants that morning. Miss Bennett, he interrupted, his tone growing notably impatient. The officer's report clearly states that you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect? Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt this time. Sarah, however, remained unruffled. Your Honor, if I may, she continued with practiced calm, I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. Judge Harrison's expression hardened, had heard every excuse in the book, and this and no more unique than Miss Bennett. This court's time is valuable. Officer's report shows no such impediment. As Sarah reached into her briefcase to pull out the pictures, Harrison was waving his hand. No need for that. The burden of knowing where and when to park falls to the driver, not the city. The exchange continued, with Sarah remaining cool and composed, while Judge Harrison became more and more confrontational, his answers brief, his voice cutting down to the regular core of house. To those watching, it seemed just one more display of the young judge exerting his authority. What was most remarkable about this exchange was how Sarah stood in extraordinary poise to this increasingly irritated judge, standing tall and keeping eye contact, answering each dismissal with the practiced patience of someone who has spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being modeled here and now. As this exchange unfolded, the tension in the courtroom mounted, even the buyer shifting uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants waiting their turn watched with growing interest. sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would transform this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment that would challenge his entire approach to justice. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his decision already formed before Sarah could finish her final statement. The fluorescent lights cast stern features as he gave his sentence. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of infraction of City Parking Code 23.4, he said, his voice reflecting finality. Given your evident lack of respect for clearly displayed signage and further efforts to question the officer's professional judgment, I'm setting the fine at $500, well above the ordinary $100 fine levied. A general murmur went around in the courtroom, as even the regular court officials exchanged surprised glances. This was quite a heavy fine for a minor parking ticket. Several lawyers present began to squirm uncomfortably at the disproportionateness of the sentence. Sarah stood stock still at the podium. Her face didn't twitch, but her eyes followed silently as Judge Harrison wrote the amount of the fine on her citation. He used a sharp, violent motion, and the young judge smiled to himself, like he thought Head made a point about respect for the law. Further, Harrison continued, his voice even severer. I'd like to make a note for the record that this court takes a dim view of citizens who try to wriggle out of their duties by calling into question the competence of our law enforcement officers. The court reporter was typing furiously, jotting down every word. The prosecuting attorneys, those that regularly appeared in this courtroom, had never heard of such a high fine for a parking ticket. A few started scribbling notes, sensing this may precede a case in court. Sarah spoke, finally. Her voice was calm and modulated, considering. Your Honor, I would accept the court's decision, she said after a moment, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I would like to say that this will unfortunately necessitate my having to conclude my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely looked up from the papers on his desk, still writing down his final remarks about the case. Miss Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are not this court's problem. You should have thought about your professional responsibilities before breaking city parking laws. The courtroom remained exceptionally still, the tension thick enough to cut. Even the bailiffs who had seen 1,000 cases come through these doors seemed to sense something big was about to. The morning sun unfolded outside and reached its peak, casting through the long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Sarah gathered her things unhurriedly, every action deliberate and serene. There was no anger, no frustration in her bearing at the harshness of the sentence. There was just something there in her person, a quiet confidence that this tale was far from over. The next case was already being called, but a number of eyes remained on Sarah. As she made her way back to her seat, Judge Harrison had already moved on, unaware that his next realization would shake the very foundations of his judicial confidence. Sarah's measured voice carried through the courtroom as she added one final comment. I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines, well, don't you, Judge Harrison, from when you were in my constitutional law class? 10 years ago, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-submature, and his face noticeably paled. The revelation struck him like an external force as recollections flooded back. Professor Bennett standing at the front of the lecture hall, charging students to deeply consider issues of justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Several of the attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped. The court clerk's fingers hovered unmoving over her keyboard. Even the normally stoic bailiff wrestled with displaying any professional composure. Judge Harrison slowly looked up for the first time that morning, really seeing Sarah Bennett. She was standing there, precisely as he had known her during his days in the law school, the same air of authority, the same inquiring glint in her eye that surmised his readiness to understand complex constitutional precepts. The irony smote. Here was Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest letters of recommendation for judicial appointment and extolled his sense of equal justice under the law, just shown how far he had strayed from those very principles. Memories tumbled back, passionate lectures about judicial temperament. Her warnings of the Sybil Way's bias could creep into decision-making. Her emphasis on treating every case with equal consideration, regardless of the defendant's background. The young judge's face flushed red with embarrassment. His earlier SMUD evaporated as he realized Head just provided a perfect case study, and exactly the kind of biased judgment Shed taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing. Her expression wasn't triumphant, nor accusing. She was still the teacher, and this had become an unexpected lesson, not just for her former student, but to everyone in the courtroom. The silence just drug and drug. Those who regularly watched the court would later claim that was the longest pause they had ever witnessed in traffic court. The morning sun continued its creep across the courtroom floor, as if a spotlight on stage, where an extraordinary drama was playing out. Judge Harrison looked down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, then back at his former professor. In that moment, he was no longer the confident young judge, but once again the law student who had sat so keen in her classroom learning about the very principles he had just failed to uphold. Judge Harrison's courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of recognition weighed heavily on his shoulders as he stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly, voice cracking. The gavel bang echoed through the silent room. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retired to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hands still shook as he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, proudly standing with the Constitutional Law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her passionate lectures about equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seeming to taunt him. He replayed in his mind the morning's proceedings in his chambers as Harrison felt. Had interrupted her sooner than he had other defendants. Had dismissed her evidence without consideration. Had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount. And had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The buy-in knocked softly to indicate that the recess was nearly over. Standing before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes, the young judge, proud of being strict yet fair, now seemed to act like exactly what he was, a man who had lost vision of the fundamental principles his professor worked so hard to instill in him. Outside his chambers, the courtroom abuzz with whispered conversations. Attorneys who regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing looks. They wondered how this revelation would change the young judge they came to know. Sarah sat before her desk, grading papers as if today was just another day in her decades-long career in teaching justice. To future lawyers, her composed nature made the moment even more touching because not only had she not come for a fight, but she had also allowed the moment to be a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths, squared his robes, and steeled himself upon re-entering the courtroom. He knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but possibly his whole judicial career. Judge Harrison stepped back into his courtroom. His body language was dramatically different. The skip in his step had been replaced by a measured stride, and his expression now was thoughtful rather than stern. Professor Bennett began. His tone was laced with an unexpected dose of humility for the frequent attendees of the court. I owe you and this court an apology. My behavior this morning fell far short of the very principles of justice you taught me 10 years ago. He took a deep breath before continuing. I'll let my position blind me to my own predispositions today. You've given all of us a valuable lesson on the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law. The courtroom was silent until Harrison reached for Professor Bennett's citation. I am waiving the $500 fine. Moreover, I am dismissing this case in its entirety based on the unclear signage to which you drew the court's attention. Sarah nodded graciously, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't just classroom theory. They were principles I swore to uphold. Today I failed to live up to those principles. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Let this be a reminder to everyone present, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice than not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and see each person before us with clear eyes. The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unprecedented, a judge publicly acknowledging his bias and correcting his mistake. Several began making notes, recognizing they were witnessing a remarkable moment in the court's history. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the same educational tone she had used in countless lectures. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. This moment illustrates why our legal system depends not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a routine traffic court session had become a profound lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The remaining defendants and attorneys watched as Harrison continued the day's proceedings with a noticeably different approach, more patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the courtroom incident, Georgetown Law, the school's central auditorium, was standing room only as Judge Michael Harrison stood at the podium alongside Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing an engrossed gathering of law students and faculty. What transpired that day in traffic court, Harrison explained, wasn't about a parking ticket, but about how our biases can blind our judgment even when we think we're being fair. The case had become a remarkably instructive tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had integrated it into her syllabus, leveraging it for a prime example of unconscious bias operating, even in seemingly minor legal matters. The story had spread beyond Georgetown legal journals and judicial education programs nationwide. Judge Harrison's courtroom was different. Observed ordinary lawyers presenting cases before him. The marked change in his demeanor signaled that every case was a possibility to be weighed seriously, regardless of how the defendant presented himself or his background. His notoriety changed from being the harshest judge to being considered one of the most open-minded on the bench. Professor Bennett had turned the incident into a seminal research paper called Justice in the Mirror, examining judicial bias in minor courts. The paper was already informing judicial training programs around the country. Sometimes Professor Bennett stood before an audience of judges and declared that the most powerful lessons about justice come in moments we least anticipate. What counts isn't that we err, but how we respond when our blind spots are revealed. The incident sparked a broader conversation within the D.C. court system. Other judges started reviewing their own decision-making patterns, yielded new guidelines for the handling of traffic court cases. Statistical analyses revealed a much-reduced trend in disparate sentencing across demographic groups. As the lecture closed, a student did ask Judge Harrison what was the single most important thing he had learned from the experience. He smiled thoughtfully before replying, "Justice isn't just about knowing the law. It's about remaining humble enough to recognize our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them." The case had become known as the professor's lesson, a reminder among law students that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we have fallen short of our ideals. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. His hands knuckle white as he grips the wooden bench. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly. The gav's sharp crack resounded through the silent chamber. Without meeting anybody's eyes, he beat a quick retreat to his chambers, black robes flowing behind him, billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison sank into his leather chair. His hands shook as he pulled an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year. Her kind but challenging eyes stared back at him through time. Memories came rushing back as if a dam had burst. Her impassioned lectures about equal justice under the law, her patient guidance during office hours as he struggled with complex constitutional concepts, and most painfully her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter set, framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock his recent actions. In the quiet of his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount. And he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The shame burned in his chest as he remembered her lessons about judicial temperament and unconscious bias. How many times had she warned their class about the subconscious ways prejudice could creep into decision-making? Now he had become a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. While in the courtroom, whispers race across the gallery as attorneys who regularly come before Harrison exchange knowing glances. Court officers try to maintain professional demeanor, but cannot help but glance at Professor Bennett with newfound respect. Sarah was calm, as if this were another teachable moment in her decades-long career grading papers. Her calm manner made the situation even more poignant. She hadn't come for confrontation, but had allowed the moment to become a powerful lesson in justice and humility. The bay knocked SL on Harrison's chamber door, indicating the recess was nearly over. The young judge stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian who had prided himself on being strict but fair now looked like exactly what he had become, a man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles his professor had worked so hard to instill. As he was about to return into court, Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but possibly his whole judicial career. It weighed heavy upon his shoulders as he straightened his robes, garnering his courage to face the truth about himself and his actions. He thought about what Professor Bennett would expect from him now. Not excuses, not defensiveness, but honest self-reflection and the ability to change course. The lessons she had taught so many years ago were about to take on their greatest test, but not in classroom discussion. It was time for real-world application. The next knock at his chamber door was insistent. The recess was ending, and decisions had to be made. With a final deep breath, Judge Harrison squared his shoulders. It was time to prove that he could indeed live up to the principles instilled in him by Professor Bennett all those years ago.